All right, well, this is from Psalm 119, starting in verse 89. Forever, O Lord, your word is settled in heaven. Your faithfulness endures to all generations. You establish the earth and it abides. They continue this day according to your ordinances. For all are your servants. Unless your law had been my delight, I would have perished in my affliction. I will never forget your precepts, for by them you have given me life. I am yours, save me. And Father, we thank you that we are yours, and that you've given us your word, and you've given us the opportunity to draw closer to you. And the reason we can do that is because of the love and the sacrifice of your Son on the cross. And it's in Jesus' name we pray these things. Amen. All right, well, it's been a little bit. We skipped last week, so I apologize for that again. But if you remember, we had started chapter 42 in Genesis. And, before that, Joseph has interpreted the dreams of Pharaoh. He's now in charge of Egypt. And now the famine is upon them. And, it started in chapter 42 with Jacob realizing, hey, there's still grain in Egypt, even though they've got a famine all over that area. And we talked about the fact that Jacob, in prior chapters, earlier in his life, had submitted to God, but it didn't really seem like at the beginning of chapter 42 that he was terribly trusting of God. Okay? And we also noticed that he was referred to in the Bible as Jacob, not as, remember, his new name that was given by God as Israel. And then we read on and we saw that Joseph's brothers came to Egypt, and of course you have to go to Joseph to get the grain, and so they came to Egypt. They at least his 10 older brothers did, and they bowed down to him, and there was that fulfillment of the dream that they so much opposed and hated years ago, that led to Joseph's, or maybe was the final straw that led to them selling Joseph into slavery. And Joseph, you remember, decided, hey, look, I'm going to test the brothers. Now he's dressed as an Egyptian. He's clean shaven. He's wearing Egyptian clothes because he's the second most powerful person in all of Egypt. Okay, and so they don't really recognize him. They don't realize it's him, although he recognizes them. And if you remember, we said that it's been pointed out that he's going to test them in a number of ways, and that he's going to test their conscience, their character, and their compassion. Okay? And if you remember, the first thing that Joseph did is he accused them of being spies. Now that puts them under a lot of pressure. Here's the second guy in charge of all of Egypt, second only to Pharaoh, who's accusing them of being spies. And he could put them in jail for the rest of their lives, or probably even have them executed. So this is pretty serious stuff, or at least it could be. And they don't know that it's not. They don't know that it's a test. And Joseph, if you remember, does not show any indication of revealing himself to his brothers, and we're going to find and see that he won't until he's convinced of where his brothers are. Have they grown and have they matured, or are they still the same brothers that sold him? And we talked to Tad about this, but as we go through this story of Joseph, there's some challenges here, as there often are in many places in the Bible. And the challenges are, we're so familiar with the story of Joseph. We think of it as a story of Joseph. But if we do that, we're kind of setting ourselves up to miss certain things. And what I mean by that is this is a story of God. Okay? We're seeing God, and we're seeing how God represents himself and how he reveals himself. And of course, if you remember, we're seeing the nature of man contrasted against the nature of God. Okay? So as we go through this story, don't think about this in terms of Joseph. God's purpose here is not to give Joseph justice or to elevate him from being a prisoner and a slave to being the second most powerful person in the world. Yes, there's an aspect of look what God can do when it's in accordance to his plans, okay? And yes, God is a just God, and he wants there to be justice. And there is, at times, some degree of justice in this world that comes from God, okay? But primarily, God is interested in molding and growing and developing us. And this includes the 10 brothers, it includes Joseph, and it still includes Jacob. And we're going to see all of that as we go through this story. Is if we keep looking at it from God's perspective, we'll see what God is doing in their lives. Okay? If you remember, the older brothers have not been acting as the representatives of God. Okay, now this will start to change as we go through the next couple of chapters. We'll start to see that they really have changed. Okay, but up until this point, what we've seen is that they've practiced pretty much evil in their lives. Okay, and that, remember, God's commitment to Abraham is to give them an eternal place in the promised land to live, to make a nation out of them that will represent him to all the nations around. And so that's what God is doing here, okay? He needs to bring the family together. He needs to convict them of their sins. He needs to get them located in a place where they're not influenced by the world, which seems to be what's going on, for this generation, the generation of the brothers, in the world of Canaan. And of course, we can say that there was a large extent of that going on in Jacob's life early on too. Okay, and what God is doing is he's using Joseph as that tool. He's going to use Joseph to make these things happen. And I do think one of the things that we see here is God making this commitment that he's going to take Abraham and the descendants of Abraham, create this nation out of them that is obedient to him, that loves him, okay, that can represent him. And just as he showed us in the very beginnings of Genesis, that he could take something that was, void and useless and turn it into a beautiful world and a beautiful creation, here he's showing I can find that one heart out of these 12 brothers, and I can use that person to bring them all back to me. Okay? And when you think about it that way, we start to see a mighty and powerful God, and we can start to see more and more why God is not threatened by the choices of man. He can give man freedom to choose, and to choose evil if he wants to, and it's not going to thwart his plans. Okay? He is still going to accomplish what he wants to accomplish. Well, when they come down and they approach Joseph, they do seem to pass this conscience test. If you remember, the brothers did to themselves, they're talking in Hebrew, clearly acknowledge that what they did to Joseph was wrong all those years ago. Okay? But also, what they didn't realize, and we'll see again because we're going to pick up and backtrack just a bit, is that Joseph understood what they were saying. He has a translator there, again, keeping up the image and the idea that he's an Egyptian, but he knows what they're saying. Now ultimately, even after this confession, Joseph, if you remember, had at first said, all of you need to stay here. We'll send one brother back And if you're not spies, you'll bring that youngest brother back and prove to me that you're not lying to me. And then when he lets him out of prison after 3 days, he changes his mind and he says, okay, all the brothers can go back and bring the grain that you need for your families, but one has to stay. And he's going to pick Simeon, and he's going to begin putting him through another test when he chooses Simeon. Well, as we speak about the brothers and where they are and have they changed, while they've admitted to themselves openly and talked, thinking that it was just them that were understanding about what they did, notice that there's no indication that they've confessed this crime against Joseph to anybody else. They seem to keep it just between themselves. And we'll come back to this in a few minutes. Okay. In fact, if you think about it, it appears that their biggest concern, even though they're confessing that what they did was wrong all those years ago, their biggest concern is for themselves in their current condition. It doesn't seem to be about just a true conviction of their evil and of what they've done in the past. Okay? All right, well, let's just pick up reading in verse 19. Well, make it verse 18.
Chapter 42?
In chapter 42. 42, yeah. And let's read between 19 and 23. Maya, can you read those for us?
Sure. I thought you said 18. So
yeah, 18. Yeah, 18. That's good.
On the third day, Joseph said to them, "Do this and you will live, for I fear God. If you are honest men, let one of your brothers stay here in prison, while the rest of you go and take grain back for your starving households. But you must bring your youngest brother to me, so that your words may be verified, and that you may not die." This they proceeded to do so. They said to one another, "Surely we are being punished because of our brother. We saw how distressed he was when he pleaded with us for his life, but we would not listen. That's why this distress has come upon us." Reuben replied, "Didn't I tell you not to sin against the boy? But you wouldn't listen. Now we must give an accounting for this blood."
And 23.
They did not realize that Joseph could understand them, since he was using an interpreter.
Okay, thank you. So over all these years, Joseph has remembered his native tongue, Hebrew, and he's understanding what's going on. Now, I think in verse 21, when they say to each other, "Truly we're guilty concerning our brother, because we saw the distress of his soul when he pleaded with us," I think there's two reasons for including that. I think the first is to understand what Joseph has gone through. And the reason that becomes important is because of what he's going to say in a few chapters. Okay? So don't miss this. This isn't one of those where they were all nicey nice and they tricked him into it. And they said, "Oh, no. You're just going on a picnic and they'll bring you back in an hour," right? Or something stupid like that. I don't know, it's just a bad example, but it's the only thing I could think of. I mean, he knew what was going on. He knew what their intention was when they threw him in the pit. He knew what they were doing when they tied him up and sold him in slavery. And he pleaded and begged with them. I think the other reason is to see just how heartless these guys were. Okay? I mean, it's one thing to have a problem with a brother or a sister or something like that, or even anybody else. Okay? But to do this with them when they're begging with you for their life, okay? And you're selling them into slavery, and you really don't know what's going to happen to them. You're never going to see them again, okay? And he's going to work the rest of his life. And let's face it, slaves in certain cultures were not particularly well treated, okay? And they just have no concern for him whatsoever. And I think that's important to see, because Here we get this idea. Notice it, and it said in verse 21, then they said to one another. It's not one of them, it's all of them. Now, the reason I think this is important is to recognize that, Joseph was in prison and was a servant in Potiphar's home for 13 years. Some combination, between those two places. And then he gets elevated, and we're into the famine now, which means there's been 7 years of surplus, and the famine is spread pretty bad. I have no idea. I'm just going to guess it's been at least a year of famine. Okay, so this is now on the order of like maybe 21, 22 years since they've seen each other, since this happened. And we've talked quite a bit about how God is working in Joseph's life, in his heart, showing Joseph, look, I don't care where you are, how bleak it is, how bad it is, I'm with you. And by his love, God has blessed him at every step of the way, and Joseph has learned to trust in him. But I think what these verses here are telling us, along with the story, if you remember a little bit about Judah and Tamar, and ultimately, remember, he acknowledged that Tamar was more honest and faithful than he was, because what he had done was completely wrong. I think what we see here is God has been using time to work on the hearts of the brothers too. Okay? He has been changing them. And that's what Joseph is going to try to find out, and he's going to see. But we need to understand that God uses time to work on us. He knows we can't change overnight. We just can't. We're not that way. And so you ask yourself, well, I prayed and I prayed and I prayed, and God didn't answer my prayers, and I've been praying for a year, I've been praying for 2 years, or whatever it happens to be. It may very well be because you're not ready. You're not prepared to have your prayer answered yet. And that's something we don't typically think about. I heard once many years ago, you won't find this anywhere in the Bible, but I do personally believe this is true, that all the way back in Genesis chapter 1, you remember, God created time. There was, there was evening and morning day 1. There was evening and morning day 2. That's an indication of time. And that those things started before the sun was made. Okay? I heard it said that time is one of God's most effective tools that he uses in our lives, helping us to wait and grow in patience and grow in trust, to see God's faithfulness. Okay? And I think he's been using this 20 years or so, whatever it's been, to work on them. Okay? Now, when Reuben says, did I not tell you, do not sin against the boy, and you wouldn't listen to me, I'm going to tell you personally, and I can't prove this scripturally, personally, I'm not convinced Reuben means what he says. I'm not convinced Reuben is truly repentant. I think he's basically saying, see, it's not my fault. I tried to tell you to do it the right way. And you'll see why I say that in a minute. All right, well, so most of that is really just kind of, picking back up where we had left off. Marie, will you read 24 through 28 now, please?
And he turned himself away from them and wept. Then he returned to them again and talked with them. And he took Simeon from them and bound him before their eyes. Then Joseph gave a command to fill their sacks with grain, to restore every man's money to his sack, and to give them provisions for the journey. Thus he did for them. So they loaded their donkeys with the grain and departed from there. But as one of them opened his sack to give his donkey feed at the encampment, he saw his money, and there it was in the mouth of his sack. So he said to his brothers, my money has been restored, and there it is in my sack. Then his their hearts failed them, and they were afraid, saying to one another, "What is this that God has done to us?"
Okay. Now, as I said in verse 23, Joseph is speaking through an interpreter. He's probably speaking Egyptian to them. That's part of why earlier in the chapter it says, he spoke roughly to them or harshly to them. Some people believe that that's the way the Egyptian language sounds to people who speak Hebrew. Okay, but it could have been that he was really strict with them. Either way, he's keeping up this pretense that he is truly Egyptian. He's keeping his identity hidden. Okay. Um, in verse 24, he turns away from them and weeps. Completely understandable. I mean, he's heard them. He's heard what they said. You can imagine the impact that must have had on him. And I suspect part of the weeping is not just simply their acknowledging what they did was wrong, but also a little bit of this, again, maybe, Reuben, he picks up the same way I'm speculating, that Reuben is basically saying, well, it was your fault, not mine. This idea that, not only did he try to stop them, but maybe it's more about, well, I was right and you were wrong, kind of a thing. But regardless, he's so moved by this and so upset by this. When it says he turned away, the idea is that he left the room. Okay, and we see that it was when he returned them, he spoke to them. Okay, and notice how verse 24 ends. It's really harsh, isn't it? It's just really straightforward. He takes Simeon from them and bound them before their eyes. Now, why do you think he does that?
So he's recreating what they did to him.
That's exactly what he's doing. Okay.
Look, how do you think it felt?
He's forcing them to relive the moment, and I think this is part of the test. As he takes him, and by the way, in the Hebrew, bound means basically to harness or to chain up or to tie up. It's pretty specific that this is not just a case of two guards come over and grab him by the arms and lead him away. Okay, however they bound him, leather straps, chains, harnesses around his neck, like had been done to Joseph when he was in jail. I don't know, but the impression is it's pretty stark and harsh. Okay, and I suspect Joseph is watching the expression on their faces very carefully. Okay, I think he's doing it to see how do they react to this. Okay, and like you say, they're essentially reliving what he did. I wouldn't be surprised if Joseph had instructed his guys to do it in a way that was similar to the way he was bound. And I don't know what that means, but as much as he could make it the same, I bet he did that. Okay, can't prove it. I just think he's trying to see what are they going to do. Okay. So in verse 25, Joseph also begins to set up the very next test. Notice that Joseph gave orders to fill their bags with the grain. Okay, that's what they came down, and they had apparently paid for it, because it says, and to restore every man's money in his sack, and to give him provisions for the journey. And thus the servants did. Well, not surprising. They're going to do exactly what he says. Okay. Now, why would Joseph do that? Remember, he's just accused them of being spies.
Well, now he's setting them up to say that they were thieves.
He's setting them up, and isn't it reasonable to presume that thievery and spies, particularly back in that day and age, could go together, right?
I mean, if they don't say anything when they come back, like, oh, we got our money back, then he knows that they haven't changed. But if they fix up and say, look, somehow our money was returned, please take it.
So, but I think you said something that to me is really important. Joseph knows how long this famine's going to last. They don't. See, they're probably hoping they come down, buy grain, go back, famine's over, done. Right? Joseph knows they're coming back. This is why he can keep Simeon. This is why he can give them their money back. Because when they have to come back, he gets to find out, do they confess the fact that they ended up with all of this money? Does that make sense? Do you see what he's doing there?
Because he told them to bring the youngest brother too.
Yeah, and he's kept Simeon. Okay, right? So he binds them in front of their eyes. He's going to keep Simeon, and part of the test is, well, do you really care about Simeon or not? You know, are you going to confess the money when you have to come back? Because you're going to have to come back. So now I don't know this. This is again, I'm doing a lot of speculating here. Okay, they lead Simeon off, but you don't get later on. You don't get the impression that Simeon has necessarily stayed in jail the entire time. We don't know. Okay, but I don't know that he actually, or if he has, it may not have been that bad. Maybe he's just imprisoned with the other servants, so to speak. I don't know. But here's that character test. Will they admit the money, and will they come back, or will they just, basically say, yeah, Simeon's yours, right? So they load their donkeys up, not knowing that they've got all this extra money and the grain, and they depart. And on the way back home, and it's about an 11-day journey, as one of them opens their sack to give his donkey fodder, where they stay for the night or whatever, he finds the money in the mouth of his sack. And notice what the brothers say in verse 28. My money has been returned, and behold, it is in my sack. And my translation says, and their hearts sank, and they turned to trembling to one another, saying, what is this that God has done? Well, all of the things we've talked about in one way, form, or another, the brothers kind of understand, with the exception of the fact that the famine is going to last 6 more years, or whatever it's going to be. Okay, they understand they're in quite a predicament, and they probably understand that if Joseph is doing any accounting of funds, if they're doing any decent accounting for the money returned and sold and all this kind of stuff, they're going to know that these guys had the money, right? So, it really furthers, as we said earlier, Joseph's claim that they've stolen money because they're spies, okay? And they know that they do have to come back, regardless of how the famine runs, how long it goes. They got to come back just to get Simeon, and so they're going to have to deal with this. And notice that their response is their hearts sank. Now I find it interesting that there's a couple of things that they don't do, okay? They don't decide for the 8 of the 9 remaining brothers to go back up to Canaan with the food, and one to take the money back. They could have done that. The one could have turned it in right away. I mean, haven't you ever been at a cashier and they give you too much change or something like that? And if you notice it before you get out of the store, or right after you get out of the store, you go back and you give it back to them or something? They could have done that. They could have turned right around, but they don't. Okay? The other thing is notice that there's no admission to themselves. Hey, maybe this is a positive thing. Maybe God is giving them a blessing. But their initial statement is, what has God done to us? And
They
this
don't seem to realize this is a result of their own actions.
Well, there's truth to that, right? And in a sense, they are again, in a sense, admitting and confessing their own sin. Okay, hey, my money's been returned. Their hearts sink, and they're going to go on and essentially do that eventually. But there's also this aspect of hey, what has God done to us? As in, holy crap, this is more of now we're finally paying the price. Okay? Now, as we said, ultimate justice comes from God. Okay? But generally, it comes later. Okay? Judgment and justice and fairness are all going to come at a later time. They're going to come at the end of time when the world is getting judged and things like that. Okay? That there is a degree of justice that God gives out in this world, but for the most part, it's a fallen world. Okay? And we have a choice. We can confess and deal with the consequences of what we've done here and now, or we can let God deal with us more severely later. We can look at the way God handles things and we can say, well, there's a blessing in this, and God will somehow take care of us. Or you can look at it and say, oh no, what evil has God done to us now? And now what do we do? You see, they almost take this position of God is against us because of what we've done. And the truth is not that. What is God really doing? Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, he's setting it up so that they return to Egypt, so he moves the whole family.
He's teaching them a lesson.
Yeah, he's teaching them lessons for their own good. And they don't see that. They see their own trouble that comes now because of this. They don't even stop and say, why would God let this happen? I mean, what are possible reasons why God could let this? And they don't do that whatsoever.
Well, it sounds like us.
Yeah, it does, doesn't it?
Sure.
And yet that's what the Bible tells us to do. Remember when we read in James, it said, hey, when you go through trials and tribulations, ask for wisdom. And we talked about the idea that it was really a statement of ask for wisdom in terms of, what are you trying to teach me? Why am I going through this? What's your point? What do you want me to learn from it? How am I supposed to grow from this? And they don't look at that. They take the completely negative approach. Now in 1 John, in his epistle, in chapter 1, verse 9, John wrote, if we confess our sins, he is faithful and just to forgive us our sins and to cleanse us from unrighteousness. Isn't it possible that what God is doing here is working to cleanse them, okay, from what they've gone through? In Proverbs 28:13, we read, whoever conceals his transgressions will not prosper, but he who confesses and forsakes them will obtain mercy. And in Psalm 32, verses 3 through 4, we read, when David wrote, for when I kept silent, my bones wasted away through my groaning all day long. For day and night your hand was heavy upon me. My strength was dried up as by the heat of summer. See, I think what God is doing, and they don't realize it, is they've just confessed. Maybe for the first time. Apparently, it's the first time we've read about it, amongst themselves, what they've done. They don't realize that Joseph understood, but they've admitted it to themselves. Maybe this is the first time they've even talked about it. They felt so guilty about it. And God is starting the process, now that they've confessed, okay, of cleansing them and of returning them. But that process requires sometimes a difficult road. And God does this in our lives too. Times when we finally realize, maybe we didn't even know it, that what we had done or what we had said was sinful. Okay? And once God's Spirit brings it to our awareness, remember Jesus said in the upper room, the Holy Spirit will bring you into all understanding and remembrance and awareness. And that part of his role was to convict us of our sins. Okay? As he does that, okay, he begins the process of healing, of cleansing, and of changing. but it's not always necessarily a pleasant journey. Okay? And that's, I think, what the brothers are starting to go through. See, the brothers believe God has put them into this position. And indeed, actually, he has. He just used Joseph to do it. God is working in their lives and their hearts to bring about the necessary and the needed changes to redeem them from the influences of the Canaanite, the evil Canaanite people groups. And we've talked about this in the past. Okay? That the evil and the ungodliness of the Canaanite people groups has apparently infiltrated, Jacob's family, and now God has to get this out of them. He has to bring them back to him. Now, notice that, as we've talked about, their initial reaction is negative. They assume that this is negative. They do not even for an instant think, hey, maybe God is doing something good here. They presume God is doing something evil. How we feel about God dictates how we see the world. When we see God as a loving God whose intention is to grow us for our own good, and that the trials and the tribulations he allows are for our benefit and not for evil, it changes everything that we see. James wrote in chapter 1 again, verse 13, he said, "Let no one say when he is tempted, I am being tempted by God. For God cannot be tempted by evil, and he himself does not tempt anyone." Now, this concept is a major theme of this part of Genesis, this part of the story of Joseph. That God is not tempting them, but God is allowing evil done by other men, consequences of what they've done themselves and things like that. He's allowing that in order to redeem them. Okay? Now, it's also interesting to notice that the brothers have acknowledged now, at least amongst themselves, that what they did was wrong. They've acknowledged their sin. But I do want you to keep in mind something. There's no record in the Bible that says that they ever told Jacob what really happened. Even after they informed Jacob that Joseph is alive. There's no record that they tell Jacob what they did, or how Joseph got to be alive. Okay? There's also no indication that Joseph ever tells Jacob. Now, I bring that up because it's interesting to think about what that means relative to redemption, growth, salvation, and the maturing of the brothers. Okay? To turn that over in your mind and think about that. Now, while I've said that, I should point out to you that Jewish people, Jewish scholars, Jewish rabbis have debated this point for generations and generations. It's even written down in the Midrash from hundreds of years ago. Okay? And there's no clear agreement from these scholars in terms of whether or not Jacob ever figured it out or not. Both opinions are stated. Okay? Some read into the account, and I've seen why they say this, and I think it's very weak personally. But some have read into the account that Jacob must have known. Others assume, much like I'm doing right now, that because it's not stated anywhere in the Bible, that he never finds out. Okay? It's worth meditating on and praying about, because I think it tells us about the human nature. Okay? Anyhow, I just point that out for you. Okay? All right. Well, let's pick back up in 29. I think that's where we left off. Maya, would you read 29 through 33, please?
Sure. Hang on 1 second. So, oops. Why can't I need my reading light. Hold on. Okay. When they came to their father, Jacob, in the land of Canaan, they told him all that had happened to them. They said, "The man who is Lord over the land spoke harshly to us and treated us as though we were spying on the land. But we said to him, 'We are honest men, we are not spies. We were 12 brothers, sons of one father. One is no more, and the youngest is now with our father in Canaan. Keep going.
Yeah, through 33.
The man who is Lord over the land said to us, "This is how I will know whether you are honest men. Leave one of your brothers here with me, and take food for your starving households, and go."
Okay. And Marie, will you read 34 through the rest of the chapter?
And bring your youngest brother to me, so I shall know that you are not spies, but that you are honest men. I will grant your brother to you, and you may trade in the land. Then it happened, as they emptied their sacks, that surprisingly each man's bundle of money was in the sack. And when they and their father saw the bundles of money, they were afraid. And Jacob their father said to them, "You have bereaved me. Joseph is no more, Simeon is no more, and you want to take Benjamin. All these things are against me." Then Reuben spoke to his father, saying, "Kill my 2 sons if I do not bring him back to you. Put him in my hands, and I will bring him back to you." But he said, "My son shall not go down with you, for his brother is dead, and he is left alone. If any calamity should befall him along the way in which you go, then you would bring down my gray hair with sorrow to the grave."
So they come back in 29, and they tell their dad. Notice, what's the name that the Bible is using for their dad right now?
Israel.
Not Israel.
Jacob.
Oh, Jacob.
Jacob. They're calling him Jacob, which means it's a signal to us that he's acting in the flesh. Okay, he's not walking in the spirit. Okay, so they come back to their dad Jacob in the land of Canaan, and they tell him everything. Verse 30, the Lord of the land, spoke harshly with us. It took us as for spies for the country. Basically we told them, no, we're honest men. We would never do that. Right. Notice how often they claim to be honest men. I find that just really interesting. And yet we do that ourselves, right? We fool ourselves. Oh, but I'm an honest man. Really? I bet there's a lot of folks in Washington who are saying they're honest men right now. Verse 32. We're 12 brothers. They go on with their story. Sons of our father, one's no longer alive, and the youngest is with us, with our father today in the land of Canaan. And the man, the Lord of the land, said to us, "By this I will know that you're honest men. Leave one of your brothers with me, and take the grain and famine for your household, and go. But bring your youngest brother to me, that I may know that you're not spies, but honest men. I will give your brother to you, and you may trade in the land." Now notice how many times this concept of honest men is brought up just in these verses, right? Are they really honest men?
Yeah.
So why do you say that? Now, there's an irony here that I think needs to be pointed out. Why do you say that?
Because of what they did to their brother. I mean,
Okay. All right. What else?
What they the group when they murdered all those people.
Okay. What else?
They still haven't come clean with their father.
They haven't come clean with their father.
Yeah.
Look, what happened after they were released from prison just a few verses ago? They confessed it to themselves. They left that part of the story completely out. They don't tell Jacob everything. They had the opportunity. Now, I get it. I'm not blaming them. I've been in similar situations. I didn't sell my brother into slavery, but I've been in similar situations where I just kind of left out the part where I look really bad. Okay, all right, and it is. I mean, it's human nature. It's our instincts, right? Okay, but the brothers seem to almost have had this breakthrough, and they need to bring Benjamin back to Egypt. But they can't say to Jacob, "Look, we screwed up before. We won't do it again." And we do know that there's some essence of truth to that, for the simple reason that as soon as they get back, Reuben even says, "Look, we got to go back and get Simeon." And we're going to come to that in a minute. Okay?
No, I like the way that Jacob says, "Well, Simeon is no more," and to me that means that if they didn't have to go back, they wouldn't have.
But who said it?
Jacob.
Jacob. Jacob says that, right? So what's his attitude still about the older 10 brothers?
He doesn't care.
Yeah, I need them to raise and take care of the herds and the crops. But, hey, you take them. I don't, I mean, he could care less. What is he clearly saying here? Who's more important?
Benjamin.
Benjamin. Do you get the impression that Jacob cares at all about his second oldest son being in jail?
Yeah, I mean, he'd send them all back if but not Benjamin. I mean, he'd risk all of them.
And so I think you're seeing why he's referred to as Jacob here in this part. He's walking in the flesh. Well, too bad for Simeon. Poor Simeon. Would have been better if it had been Reuben, but oh well. I mean, you don't see a lot of concern in him. And he is reinforcing, and I think this is really important, particularly as we get into next chapter. Okay? He's reinforcing to the brothers what? He still plays favorites. The sons of Rachel, Joseph, whom he thinks is dead, and Benjamin are more important than the rest of them. He loves them more. And I got to tell you, if you think about this from the brothers' sake, now they haven't admitted what happened to Jacob, but they've admitted it to themselves. They've been through a very difficult event. I'm guessing it was not easy watching Simeon. I'm guessing Simeon, they care for Simeon, okay? All right? And they get back, and the first thing that their dad says is basically, poor Simeon. I hope he doesn't rot in jail too long, right? I mean, there's no indication on his part, oh crap, what are we going to do? We got to get Simeon back.
He wrote him off.
He wrote him off.
He's gone.
Like, it's gone. Well, good thing I had 12. I'm down 2, I still got 10. I mean, that's kind of the way it comes across. So for the brothers, and I am sneaking now into chapter 43 because you won't see it until next time. But for the brothers then to actually start to show that they do care about Benjamin, and they don't care anymore about their father's preferential treatment is actually quite a thing. Okay, and I want to set that so that you can see it next time. Okay, now in verse 35, they all go about unpacking and getting out the grain and everything else, and as they're unpacking, they find out, it wasn't just the one brother whose money was returned. All of their money is returned. It's in every one of their sacks. Okay? And notice what it says, and at the end of verse 35, and the brothers saw their bundles of money, and they, not him, not the brothers alone, they're all dismayed. So the whole thinking, the whole approach to what has God done to us that we just got done talking about, Jacob's a part of that mindset. See, I think part of the problem with the sons comes from Jacob. It's not just the Canaanites. God's still not done working in Jacob. Now, I know we all slip and I know we all fall, even once we're saved. And I'm not trying to suggest we don't. But I think this is partly why we see sometimes Jacob referred to as Jacob, walking in the flesh, and sometimes we see him referred to as Israel. God's still working in him too. Okay? Now, in verse 36, the father Jacob said to them, "You have bereaved me of my children. Joseph is no more." He's wrong. "And Simeon is no more." He's wrong. "And you would take Benjamin." Well, that part's true. "All these things are against me." Now, it is really interesting that that they say this. You know, like I say, the gravity of the situation starts to make itself known to them. Okay, it's not just that to go back and get Simeon, they got to explain one bundle of money. Now they got to explain all of it, which is going to look really, really bad, right? But beyond that, it's this idea that Jacob's not trusting God either. And you'd think he would, okay? I mean, doesn't he remember the promises to Abraham, to Isaac, and even that were repeated to him, that his descendants would be like the sands of the seas and stuff like that? Right? Now I understand that this is a big problem. I'm not trying to minimize it. But I am saying that what Jacob is doing here is he's minimizing the ability of God in this situation. He's eliminating and forgetting the promises of God. He's basically saying God can't overcome this situation, even though he promised to take care of me and my family. And we do the same thing today. Something bad happens and we say, well, God can't overcome this. Look how bad it is. The world can't overcome it. I can't overcome it. I can't fix this. I can't do this. I can't do that. And we minimize the fact that God has promised us he will take care of us. Doesn't mean necessarily the way we want to, because of all the things we just got done talking about. His intention is to grow us and mature us and mold us into the image of his Son. And it may happen in ways that aren't always easy. Okay? But it's about the attitude. How do you look at these things? Do you look at it as coming from the hand of God for your own good? Or do you look at it as evil that you can't overcome and now you're screwed? Okay? He's thinking about these issues and these options and the problems from a completely worldly perspective. How do I, little Abraham, old and feeble, go down with these worthless sons and get my boy back? Or if the famine continues, how do we go down and buy more food from him? See, he's driven by his own personal desires, his own personal thinking. He's limiting himself. It's been said, okay, that when we focus on our problems, at least in our own mind, become really big and our God becomes really small. And that's exactly what Jacob is doing here. But when we focus on God and we remember all the things that he has done, then the problems actually get small and our God gets big. This is why if you read through the Psalms, so many times the Psalms will start off, particularly the Psalms of David, about, oh, woe is me, this happened, or my enemies are this, or they've surrounded me, or this or that. They desire my life, whatever. But by the end of the Psalm, he's focusing on God, and his attitude changes completely. I tell people all the time, when you start your prayers, start by remembering all that God has done for you. Recite it frequently. I think that's why it's in the Psalms so many times. You know, we see repeated, well, God, you led us with a mighty hand out of Egypt. Oh, you split the seas, we walked across it. Even though we wandered for 40 years in the desert, you provided all that we needed, even though we doubted, even though we grumbled, even though we mumbled, and you still brought us to the promised land. Okay? Think about all the things God has done in your life. Now, having said all those things, in verse 38, your father Jacob says to him, you bereaved me, blah, 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 blah. Simeon's no more. You would take Benjamin. All these things are against me. Verse 37, then Reuben spoke to his father, saying, you may put my 2 sons to death if I do not bring them back. And to Reuben's credit, He's basically trying to assuage the concerns of his dad. I think he's still trying personally. I think he's still trying to get the double blessing and get that blessing of the oldest son back. Okay, but we'll talk about that in a minute. But he does mention and imply right there that, hey, look, we gotta go get Simeon. We can't leave him in prison. All right, well, that's a big deal. Okay, that really is. But having said all that, if I was Jacob, I wouldn't trust Reuben either. Reuben has not been exactly a pillar of confidence. He slept with one of Jacob's wives. Okay, he was involved in the massacre. Okay, he's not this paragon. I wouldn't trust him either. Okay, and we see that in verse 38. But Jacob said, "My son shall not go down with you, for his brother is dead, and he alone is left." Is that true? No. There's 10 other brothers. Now, one of them's in prison in Egypt, but imagine how that makes them feel. Joseph is dead, and Benjamin's the only one left. Really? What about us? Right? And like I say, keep this in mind as we move into 43. But Reuben, to his credit, did indicate, look, you got to go back and get him. And Jacob completely shuts him down and says, look, I ain't doing this. And if something should befall Benjamin, basically, I'll spend the rest of my life grieving, and when I die, I'll be grieving for Benjamin as well as now Joseph. Okay. So again, Jacob is pretty much indicating, nah, Simeon's not worth it. We're not going down there. Okay. And he's taking this attitude of, well, look, the family can't last that long. Things will get better. Blah 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 blah. He's not too concerned about these things. Doesn't care that he's in prison. That type of thing. Okay.
Well, I think the interesting thing too is, like you said, I mean, none of them were praying about it.
None of them were praying about it. Okay. I mean, why doesn't Jacob say, hey, look, God's gotten me out of pickles in the past. Let's all go pray about it. Okay. And he doesn't do that. Okay. But let me ask you something. I want to spend a minute or two looking carefully at Reuben's offer, because on the surface it looks really great. Hey, look, let us go with, essentially what he's saying is, let's go with Benjamin. If anything happens to Benjamin, you can put my 2 sons to death.
I look at it that he doesn't really care about his own sons.
Not only that, what does Reuben put on the line of his own? For all you know, Reuben cares no more about his sons than Jacob cares about Reuben. Right? Reuben's not putting his flesh on the line. He's putting his sons.
Yeah.
We don't know that.
To me, I find it incredible. He's just like, yeah, okay, we can kill my kids.
Yeah, kill my kids. We don't know that they've ever done anything wrong.
What they did to the brother, and that they got to go back and they can't leave their one brother there. He doesn't know for a fact that nothing's going to happen to anybody.
He's basically, Reuben is telling his dad, well, trust me to get your son back. And let me prove that to you, because I don't care about my sons. Are you going to trust a guy to bring back Simeon who doesn't care about his own boys? He's got no concern for his own sons. It's all about him. That's why I'm saying I think Reuben maybe is doing more likely a little bit of grandstanding. Oh, hey, I'm the oldest. You can hold me accountable. That's it. Hold me accountable. Kill my boys. Yeah, that's great. He's really accountable, right?
But another look at it is maybe his boys are beloved to him, and he's trying to tell his dad, look, if you can take away my beloved sons, if I don't know, just a thought.
I understand. Remember this when we get to the next chapter. Okay. Now contrast this. Contrast Reuben's offer with Jesus's. Reuben's guilty.
Mhm.
He's part of the group that sold him. And he says, well, if it doesn't work out, punish my boys. Jesus isn't guilty. Jesus lived a sinless life. Jesus is God. Man put ourselves into this position of being sinful, fallen creatures worthy of damnation. And every one of us continually chooses worldly ways or our desires or our own fleshes or something like that over God's way. Even once we're saved, we still frequently do that. It's a struggle, just like Paul wrote about. Okay? But look at what Jesus did. Jesus said, it's not my doing. I had nothing to do with this. But take my life for theirs. See, we said, and Jesus said it himself, that when you read the pages of the Bible, you see me in it. Okay? That's the standard that Reuben should have been living up to. Now, of course, he doesn't know it, really. Okay? And yet, his great-grandfather, Abraham, took Isaac to be sacrificed. And Isaac didn't object and stop him. That's the model that they have in their family. This is how far they have fallen. Okay? Man's in a position where he can't save himself. But instead, the perfect Son of God did it voluntarily. And here we see Reuben saying, you can hold me accountable, but, take it out on my boys. In John chapter 10, verses 17 through 18, we read that Jesus said, "For this reason the Father loves me, because I lay down my life that I may take it up again. Nobody takes it from me, but I lay it down of my own accord. I have authority to lay it down. I have authority to take it up. This charge I have received from my Father." When we talk about how far the boys have fallen, we can look at the standard, not that we live up to that standard whatsoever, but we can see God's nature contrasted to man's nature. Because here, honestly, Reuben represents all of us at some level. They're not trusting God. They don't go to prayer. They don't listen to the promises that God has made. They look at it from a negative point of view. They're focused on the problem, not on God. And then Reuben says, well, you can hold me accountable, but not too much. We also see a foreshadowing that Reuben is not going to be forgiven by Jacob. He's not going to receive the blessing of the eldest son when the time comes. Okay? The next chapter will clarify that more, and ultimately we will see that. Jacob is not going to give the blessing to Reuben. Okay, the blessing that Jacob so desperately wanted. He will not give it to his oldest son. And I think part of it, this is why I say I don't think Reuben is particularly genuine in his offer here. And I think Jacob understands it. Okay. Isn't it interesting, and this is the last point for today, isn't it interesting that Joseph, whom they sold into slavery, is now using his position that God has put him into to force them collectively, Jacob included, and the older brothers, he's forcing them to determine, is Simeon worth redeeming? It's interesting how this worm is turned. It's not simply that he is now the second most powerful man in that known part of the world, okay, is that he's putting them back in the exact same position, and he's saying, you decide. You see, they could have felt guilty after what they did to Joseph and chased after those traitors and bought him back. They could have done something like that. And here they are now charged with spies, having all the money returned to them, and Simeon's in jail. And quite frankly, given the way they were 20 some odd years ago, I think they probably would have left Simeon down there. Okay? And Joseph is going to say and wants to know, have you changed? Are you willing to put your life out there to come back down and redeem Simeon? Because when they show up with this money, having been accused of being spies, what's the worst that could happen? They could be put to death for being spies. Joseph could come to the conclusion they don't know it's Joseph, but the man, as they refer to him, could come to the conclusion, see, you really are spies. And thieves. Okay? And he just puts them to death just to make a point. Or he throws them in prison for the rest of their life. They have a very difficult decision that they have to make. Okay? And Joseph has put them into that position. And God himself is behind this. And he's using Joseph to do it. See, he's forcing the brothers to make a decision. Have you ever been in a situation where you chose to do the wrong thing, and then sometime later you found yourself in a similar situation, and you actually started thinking about, oh my gosh, this is what I did last time. What am I going to do now? That's where the brothers are. Joseph puts them in this position, and essentially God is giving them a second chance. Are you going to make the same decision or not? Now God knows, but until they make that decision, they don't prove it. Okay? And so one of the messages for us today is, as we grow and mature in our walk with the Lord, as we know more about God, do we choose to make decisions today that are in greater alignment with God's ways compared to what we did in the past? And we should be able to look back at our life. And I don't recommend doing it like in weekly buckets or monthly buckets. Even a year is sometimes too short. Don't go back and ask, have I grown in the last week? Have I grown in the last month, the last 6 months? Like I say, maybe not even the last year. But where was I 3 years ago? What kind of person, what kind of man, what kind of woman, what kind of godly person was I 3 years ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago? Is God working in me? Because that's a time scale here. God doesn't do this in 6 months. He waits 20 plus years before he allows them to be in this position, because he knows it takes time. All right. Any last thoughts or comments or questions? Okay. Who wants to pray to?
Have one comment.
Yeah, what?
It's kind of depressing, because what if you don't see a lot of progress, or any progress, or you don't think you do?
Well, I think that's a great question.
Or you say, I'm worse than I was. Well, I'm not. I know I'm not, but
Well,
but I'm not as good.
But
as
this is why I suggest you don't look at 1 year intervals or 1 week intervals, because we do have ups and downs. Okay. And we could periodically. I mean, there's no doubt that there are weeks, there are days, there are months where I can look at myself and say, I'm not doing as well as I was last year. I'm doing worse. Okay. But God is not interested in how you do, in a short period of time. The Christian walk is not a sprint, it's a marathon.
Okay.
Right? Plus, God judges us by what's in our heart. But he asks us by faith then to let that come out, to let our decisions and our actions of our lives reflect that faith that we have in God. And that's the practice, that trust that takes a while to really develop. And we do it by baby steps. It doesn't happen all at once. Okay? And, just like the brothers who've done all of this evil, they still remain the heads of the 12 tribes. God doesn't say, let's take Joseph and start over. In 500 years, 400 plus years, he's going to be working with the Israelites after Moses has led them out. And they're going to be terrible. And God's going to get so mad at them, he's going to say to Moses, he's going to say, that's it. I'm wiping them all out. I'm going to start over with you, Moses. Now, Moses, no, he doesn't really mean it. He's testing Moses, okay? Because Moses is pretty frustrated with the people too. But my point is, he could have done that with Joseph too, but he doesn't. You see, we see God here redeeming a family. This is what he wants to do, okay? And so while it is depressing, it depends on whether we focus on where we are or we focus on the goodness of God and his mercy and his forgiveness. All right? All right. Anything else?
No, thank you.
Okay, who wants to pray?
I can.
Okay.
Dear God, thank you again for this time together so that we can come to know you better. Thank you always for being there for us. Help us to really look at ourselves, to have that, to be uncomfortable, to come before you and just rise, because for me, I know what I've done. I know who I was. I welcome you helping me understand how to get better, to follow you more. None of us on this call have ever known true hunger, true hopelessness, no home, no family, no job. We have been so blessed by you, and we are so undeserving. For that, I thank you forever for your Son, Jesus Christ, who has saved us all when we don't deserve it. Thank you. Amen.
Amen.
Amen. Thank you.